All right, I'll call this workshop for council in order. We're going to start off with the Pledge of Allegiance from Councilmember Thomas. All right, Mr. Johnson, please call the roll.
Councilwoman Fugit,
Here.
Councilwoman McKenzie, Councilwoman Parker,
Here.
Councilwoman Ryder,
Here.
Vice Mayor Alberto,
Here.
Councilwoman Singh, Councilman Smith,
Here.
Councilman Testerman,
Here.
and Councilman Thomas. 7 present, Vice Mayor.
Thank you. All right. Well, I want to welcome everyone here that's joining us on TV, but also those that are here in the audience. We're going to be discussing the form-based codes, specifically the South Waterfront Code. Wanted to welcome some of our presenters that we're going to have with us today. We've got Liz Albertson, with City Redevelopment's planner, R.J. Justice, the City Deputy Economic Development Officer, Brian Berry, Deputy Director of Plans Review and Inspection, Christina McGrons from the Law Department, David Brace, Deputy to the Mayor and COO, and I saw Deputy to the Mayor Gill in the audience as well, so wanted to mention her as well. You know, the form-based code is different than we see in other parts of town, and so I think this workshop's very helpful just for everyone to understand what's going on there. And the South Waterfront is certainly one of Knoxville's great locations, and we're seeing a lot of activity there. So I think this is a very good workshop for us to be having today. I'd like to get us started off, though, with some deeper context and history by calling on Councilmember Smith, who can talk to us a little bit about the form-based code and South Knoxville Waterfront. Councilmember Smith.
Thank you, Vice Mayor. First, I want to thank my colleagues for your willingness to support this workshop and showing interest in this really important part of the First District, but it's a vibrant part of the entire city, not just the First District. Some of you may remember my first evening on council was related to a variance in the South Waterfront, so near and dear to my heart in that way. We've made some good progress. I think staff is going to review some of that in terms of transparency and process. This is the more code-oriented part of the discussion tonight. So while we've made some good progress, there's a group that's been formed to look at some small changes that can make a big impact. I also want to say a big thank you to people who were part of this development of this South Waterfront Vision plan, and some of them are here tonight, but there's a number of people throughout the city who voiced their perspective years and years and years ago, and development takes time. And so I think it's really important that as time passes with a unique form-based district, that we do our best to look for tweaks. And so I think what you'll hear tonight is some recommendations about what those surgical adjustments need to be, and there's always room for improvement. So that bit of context, I think, is important just to know, this vision plan stems 15 plus years, and it's important from time to time to evaluate what's gone well and what hasn't. And there's plenty of, I don't remember the percentage, but at the South Knoxville Open House, there was a lot of interest in all the development that's happened, but it's still, I think, less than half of the properties have, that were empty or blighted have been redevelopment. So there's still a long way to go before the vision is realized, if it's ever realized. But we keep making good impact and making good progress. It's important that we be reflective as well. So that's all the context I would add for this. But again, I want to thank my colleagues for your active participation in this. It's important.
Thank you very much. Well, I'll turn it over to Liz Albertson, who's going to walk us through the presentation today. Welcome again, and thank you for being here. So we'll let you go ahead.
Thank you, Vice Mayor Roberto. Again, I'm Liz Albertson. I'm a planner working on economic development with my colleague R.J. Justice and David Brace, and I've been working most recently since March with the advisory group working on form-based codes. And previously, I was with Knox Planning for about 15 years, so you've probably seen me around. But Knoxville is lucky in that we have two form-based districts that foster a walkable and pedestrian-friendly environment in some of our most iconic parts of the city, including both the Cumberland Avenue area and the South Waterfront area. So in 2006, after extensive public involvement, a vision plan for the South Waterfront was adopted by City Council. And subsequently, in 2007, the form-based code for South Waterfront District was adopted as part of the zoning ordinance. The South Waterfront District is based on the vision plan. It is, however, considered a regulating plan, and it is divided into 7 sub-districts in the South Waterfront area. Cumberland Avenue was adopted in 2013, and it consists of 5 sub-districts. So just so we can familiarize ourselves with zoning, conventional zoning versus form-based zoning, it's important to note that conventional zoning is what we have in the majority of the city. It is defined by purpose statements that go along with each zone district, and then land uses are permitted within each of those zone districts. Lot sizes and density are regulated, and then generally there's a separate document that provides standards for public infrastructure such as streets, and that's the minimum subdivision regulations. However, in Knoxville, we also have special districts with design guidelines, such as our historic and infill overlay areas. These zone districts sit on top of the base zones, which are used to regulate uses, and these provide guidelines that deal primarily with building design and facade specifications. These are also under the review of an appointed board that have specific knowledge about each of those districts. Our form-based districts are different in that they are guided by a vision and intent statement, and they provide design standards for facades, including materials, transparency, and building openings. Generally, land uses are not required to be separated as long as the form of the building meets the intended scale of the district. Form-based codes are also providing public infrastructure standards, such as design standards for streets, and that would include cross-sections specifying where the sidewalk should be, where landscaping should be, to create a good environment for pedestrians. And in the case of the South Waterfront District, we also have standards for the Riverwalk, which is the area along the river. So this is an example of what one of the form code sub-districts looks like. This is the SW3 district along Sevier Avenue. You can see here in yellow. This is pulled directly from the zoning ordinance. So it's very different from the rest of the zoning ordinance, and then it's a highly graphic code. There are a lot of maps and a lot of cross-sections and designs and reference photos. And just an example of the extent of the vision and intent statement for each of these sub-districts. This is the one just for the South Waterfront 3 district. So this is considered the commercial heart of the old Sevier neighborhood. And it acknowledges that there are existing historic buildings in this area, that should be preserved when possible as part of the overall redevelopment of this area. Within our South Waterfront area, we also have building massing diagrams that are provided. So here you can see the minimum size of buildings as well as the maximum size of buildings. So in most of our other zone districts across the city, we just have maximum building heights, but in most form-based districts, you also have minimum building heights. And this is an example of what one of the cross-section looks like of a street design for a commercial street. So improvements that you may see along Sevier Avenue would likely have to follow this design. So you would see both landscape planning along the sidewalk, and then you would see additions of bike lanes and travel lanes for the cars. And this is our timeline of work with the advisory group so far. So starting in January of this year, Council approved 2 resolutions, one requesting a study of the form-based zone districts, and a second that required signposting on properties that have applied for variances through the Board of Zoning Appeals. In February, Councilmember Smith helped form an advisory committee, And this group had its first meeting in March. And at this meeting, we reviewed the form district process, as well as the Board of Zoning Appeal variances that have been granted in the South Waterfront area since 2019. And in late April, the group met again, and we introduced a cap on ground floor transparency variances in the South Waterfront District. I'll go into that in more detail in subsequent slides. The group also reviewed workshop materials from a BZA training that was held with the Board of Zoning Appeals members to educate and refresh that group on the knowledge of hardships, and a discussion on parking in the South Waterfront also ensued. By late May, at the third advisory group meeting, standards were proposed for standalone surface parking lots, which presently are rather confusing and quite limited. The group also reviewed who all is involved in our administrative review committee. So this is everyone in city departments as well as Knox Planning, including fire and other agencies that review plans coming forward through the form-based code districts. The group also reviewed the review processes. So level 1, level 2, and level 3 were reviewed. And then today at this meeting, we're here to review the recommendations that we've come up with so far with you. However, this group will reconvene again in late July, where we'll talk more intensely about level 2 and level 3 review, as well as possibly standard for ground floor commercial in the South Waterfront districts. We could be back to you as late or as early as October potentially with some revised code revisions if we get on the August Planning Commission agenda for some of these. So, and next I would like to introduce you to our advisory group members. We have some in the audience with us this evening, I think. If you don't maybe mind standing up if you're on the advisory committee and just letting us recognize your participation in this process. Thank you. And we have a few other folks who were able to be with us tonight, but we have members of the community as well as members of staff that have been working diligently to try to come up with some improvements that we'll present tonight. So since we started this process, improvements have already been made to help generate the visibility of development projects that are in review in the form-based code districts. The city now has a form-based code section of its website for both Cumberland Avenue and South Waterfront, and active applications for building within those districts are in the process of being hyperlinked. So eventually you'll be able to click on those and it will drive you to the actual application for the development plan, as you see here. And then you could find out what's being proposed. So also in an effort to increase the notice of applications for related to development activity in the form-based districts, the second resolution in January that was adopted required that all signs be posted on properties that are requesting variances, as we see here for the one on Phillips Avenue. This had previously been a practice of the city, but now it is required by the code. So this is the review of variances that we did for the South Waterfront area. But before I dive too much into this, I wanted to see if anyone would like to provide an introduction from the group. I think.
Well, Ms. Toker's coming up. I do just want to thank both Councilman Smith and the advisory group. This group of citizens, they're unpaid, spent several hours of their time, had to come into the city-county building, and that group is, one, they're very knowledgeable as residents of the district, and they have done a great job of helping us see the perspective of a resident through different districts, as well as business owners. And they've also pushed us. You know, we get sometimes into our zone and get busy, and so the group has done a really good job of pushing us. So, you can see the group, and then I think Ms. Toker is going to come up. But again, Councilmember Tommy Smith, who's been a big advocate and asked for this for a couple of years. Suzanne Taravella, who's an architect. Janice Toker, I think you all know, with business owner and longtime advocate from a planner perspective. Rachel Craig, who's an Island Home resident. It was really important to have Ms. Craig on this group. She brings such a depth of history with the vision plan, the original work that went into that. She's probably the one person on this committee that was there from the start and actively involved. She's also served as a planning commissioner and has a planning degree. John Cadott, who is a resident and very vocal and strong advocate for the Scottish Pike Blunt Avenue community. And Chris Howard, who is a business owner, one of the owners of Alliance Brewing. And then you've heard, obviously, the staff, our entire team here in economic development, redevelopment has been involved. So I'll turn it over to, I believe, Ms. Toker. Thank you.
Welcome, Ms. Toker, and we're looking forward to hearing from you. But I wanted to echo what we just heard from Mr. Brace. You know, thank you and all the neighborhood advocates and neighborhood residents that were in this advisory group. I know people are working full-time jobs and then they're having to go to meetings, but it's really important. So we really appreciate you taking the time to do that.
Sure, you're going to hear a lot of thank yous tonight. So originally, Rachel Craig was going to come and kind of give a little bit of a overview or background of our working group, our advisory committee, but she unfortunately could not be here. So I hastily put this together. So I want to start out with some thank you to Tommy Smith, our first district representative, who is so supportive of the community and so supportive of helping us work with the city in making changes that we'd like to see. I also want to thank the city staff that has been working with us. You guys have been wonderful in doing some review and being really open to listening and allowing us to give some feedback. Appreciate it. We want to thank City Council, and we appreciate your vote to review this form-based code in this workshop, particularly to the administrative sections as pertains to the South Waterfront. In December, there were citizens that came forward with some concerns. You listened, you're taking action, and we appreciate it. Also, to the volunteers in the advisory group, participants volunteering our time to help craft recommended changes. The advisory group includes city and community members with diverse backgrounds and perspectives. However, we all have a common interest to ensure we have a South Waterfront the community envisioned 16 years ago and continues to envision today. We came together not looking to open the code to major overhaul, nor to change the vision, rather, as David Brace said it best, to make recommendations on needed surgical improvements to the South Waterfront zoning district, ensuring the original vision as stated in the vision plan is realized as much as possible. Code elements in the ordinance are not arbitrary. They were carefully crafted to have a direct line back to the vision plan objectives: urban environment, mixed use, pedestrian friendly, public access to the river, community through connectedness. During our monthly meetings, we examine development patterns and what is being built, what variances are being requested and granted, looking at community input, and we focused on problem areas in terms of realizing the intent of the code. At each meeting, community members identified areas to discuss. Staff researched and provided additional information for the group discussion, and then staff consolidated the discussion into some formal recommendations. We appreciate council's time spent in this workshop to further discuss form-based code, and we hope council will soon be able to vote on the advisory group recommendations. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you. So one of the concerns that brought the advisory group together was the number of variances that have occurred in the South Waterfront area. Since 2019, there have been over 24 variances approved in the South Waterfront area. The QR code that you see there, if you scan that, it'll take you to a concept board so you can see visually where these variances occurred, what their applications were for, as well as whether or not they were approved or denied. So again, 24 were approved and only 3 were denied, which is quite a number of variances for a smaller district in a 4.5-year time period. And the most common variance setback, or most common variance types that we had were related to setbacks, building heights, as well as parking. The South Waterfront area only has a maximum parking standard. There is no minimum parking standard like there is in other parts of the city. So folks have asked for increases to the maximum parking standards in that district, as well as ground floor transparency. So, and we'll go into that in a little bit more detail related to the recommendations. So there are 2 recommendations that we are recommending at this time. We do have another meeting and some additional discussions to have, but the first one is related to transparency. So in the more commercial zoned or commercial form-based districts in the South Waterfront area, there's a requirement that 70% of the ground floor area adjacent to the street frontage be 70% transparent. This group is recommending that a cap be inserted that limits the ability to grant variances on this standard. So there would be no more than 60% variances or 60% transparency at the least in the South Waterfront districts if this revision were to be adopted. So this would ensure that those spaces continue to be developed in a way that in the future, while they might currently be developed as residential now, that in the future built out in a way that could easily be converted to commercial once the market is there for that. And then because we had a number of discussions about parking, we looked at what the standards were in the code currently and saw that they were pretty limited, especially when it came to surface parking lots. And there really weren't explicit provisions related to standalone surface parking lots in the South Waterfront District. So we are making recommendations for standards to be added to the code. And in reference to the transparency standards, these are 2 examples of buildings that have met the transparency standards without variances in the South Waterfront. That includes One Riverwalk on Blunt Avenue and City South on Sevier Avenue. And these are standards that we're recommending for the standalone surface parking lots. So right now, there would have to, if these provisions were to be recommended for adoption and were inserted into the code, there would have to be a minimum interior and rear setback of 5 feet for these standalone surface parking lots. We would also note that there could not be a variance permitted for that standard. So it would always have to be 5 feet. Headlight screening would also be required for these type of parking lots with either a fence or a wall, and it would have to be a minimum of 42 inches high. And there would have to be vegetation planted on the side of the fence or wall adjacent to the adjacent property to help soften the way that looks for the adjacent properties. And interior parking lot landscaping would be required for these parking lots, and that would start at parking areas that are 5,000 square feet or more. So really that would be about 10 parking spaces. So if you were going to build a standalone parking lot of 10 spaces plus the drive aisles, you would have to likely provide this interior parking lot landscaping as well. And these are the standards So for every 5 parking spaces, 1 parking lot island would have to be provided. And that island would have to be planted with a shade tree, and then it would have to have a minimum 60% planted area within that island. And these island sizes are the same that we have currently in the rest of the zoning ordinance, but those standards are not required for interior parking lot landscaping unless you hit 20,000 square feet. I think you all have discussed this recently, so just to clarify, these are specific to the South Waterfront area, not to all of the rest of the city zone districts. And then while we were going through the ordinance, we noticed several places that reference old articles and old sections of the zoning ordinance. So those are really just house cleaning things that need to be clarified and point to the correct sections of code that we have now. Were not updated, during recode. So we're recommending to correct that as part of this. And we have some next steps, including the advisory group meeting on July 25th, where we will review again in detail the level 2 and level 3 review process, and also the idea about possibly requiring ground floor commercial within the South Waterfront districts, which is another thing the advisory group is interested in. And again, I mentioned this earlier, but these revisions could potentially be to Planning Commission by their August 10th meeting, and then they would come before this body by September, and could potentially be part of the code by September 19th.
Hey, Vice Mayor, I just had one other item that wasn't on the screen. It was outside the scope of really the work we were doing, but members of the committee felt it was important to consider, through our Office of Neighborhoods and Community Empowerment, perhaps a neighborhood leader developer academy where we could help educate and connect the development community to neighborhood advocates, but also help educate an expert in each neighborhood that could understand where the information is on the website, who to call, what the process is. And so, again, it's great to have Ms. Albertson. She is now leading the charge, working with Ms. Sharp to look at doing that, which I think would also be helpful because the process is complicated. It's confusing. And if you're a volunteer neighborhood advocate, how do we make it as easy as possible to gather information and to connect with the right staff? So that's not on the screen, but that is something that Ms. Albertson is looking at. Thank you.
Thank you so much. All right, it's time for council questions and discussion. I saw Ms. Parker's light go on first, so Councilmember Parker.
Thank you, Vice Mayor. I realize the advisory group has been focused primarily on the administrative review process. But I wondered if there was any discussion of how form-based codes districts are defined in general and the level of discretion that's been granted in determining what's an appropriate development and not having as many constraints as the conventional zoning. Was that discussed at all?
Yes, I would say that we discussed a lot, especially at the first meeting, just how, these form-based zone districts are different in that they really do harken back to the vision plan multiple times throughout the regulating plan, which is the zoning ordinance language, but that we're also limited as far as staff and design professionals to what's actually in the code. There's not a lot of leeway generally to refer back to the plan because the zone districts themselves are the regulating plan. If that makes sense.
Well, I'm curious more if you can elaborate on the limited staffing you were talking about and what your design is. Hard to review because of limited design staff and
Sorry. That is really like that. Staff has to have an explicit standard to refer to with enforcement, and design professionals and folks that are wanting to build within districts need to have something that's very explicit that they can say this is the standard. It really needs to be part of the code explicitly to be able to enforce it as part of a zone district, even within the form-based zone districts. So there, is a vision and intent. For instance, the vision and intent in some of the districts say that commercial uses are not permitted. And in some of the vision intent areas, it says that commercial uses and residential uses are permitted. So that vision and intent section is pretty explicit. And so, that is what staff uses in terms of deciding what the permitted uses are. Because there's really only a list of prohibited uses as well in the code. But you need specific standards to be able to implement the ordinance.
Are there any recommendations for there to be a follow-up process to explore that further? More specifics in the code?
I'm sorry, could you repeat that? I couldn't quite hear it.
Was there any discussion or recommendations made for a follow-up process that could look into that more fully to identify more specifics?
Well, we are going to go into level 2 and level 3 review at our January 25th meeting, which,
July.
July,
July.
which could be a time for us to really address more of those. But
Councilwoman Parker, I think one of the issues that had arisen was the level 2, level 3, and how that decision is made. And in the language, I think we all agree, it can be a little gray. And so that's what we're going to dig into next. And that is where there has been some discussion about discretion on that. What goes to level 3, what does not go to level 3. And, it's interesting how, group dynamics, we kind of went into it with that, but then we jumped into transparency and parking, and we're committed to that. But that's going to take a little bit more time. And so I think July and August, we're really going to dig in on that. And typically how this has worked is the committees come together, had really good dialogue. Ms. Albertson, Ms. McGrawns, and others take that information and then go sit with other lawyers, look at what kind of language could be tweaked in the code. Then the next meeting, we come back with a draft and we let the committee and advisory group, we start to chew on it again. But I think that will probably get the concern that you're raising about the discretion. But I think we all felt like the vision was really, really good. And I think Councilman Smith has said this routinely, we need to honor the vision. There's a lot of process that went into that. And the process works well, but how do we, for both the community and for Mr. Ahrens, how do we make sure that language is really clear, especially level 2 and 3? So did I answer your question?
Yeah, it did. My last comment was just that I realize this process is underway, but I would, strongly encourage the addition of representation on the advisory group from Phillips Avenue, because those are residents I've heard a lot from, and I'm glad to see a Scottish Pike resident as a part of the group, but that's just one resident from the South Waterfront out of the 11 voices. So that was just one concern I wanted to lift up.
Thank you. Councilmember Smith.
Thank you. One of the things I think, Councilman Parker, you brought up or alluded to maybe was that I always refer to is the flexibility of the form-based code inherently is going to bring some point of friction based on interpretation. So it's flexible, it should be more efficient, it should be more flexible, but it's going to come down to somebody's judgment, and there's going to be some scenario that wasn't foreseen. And so part of the reason for the level 2, level 3 clarity is to give staff a little bit more words to work with, so that they're not, accused of over-influencing or under-influencing. And so I think that you bring up a good point, and I think it's just going to be an inherent challenge. The other thing that I think is really important that I always say for the South Waterfront particularly is the standards we have set up for the South Waterfront are a decade or more ahead of our culture in the overall citywide. And so it calls for no minimum of parking. Well, people still really want to park close. It'll be another 10 or 20 years maybe before the average person, some of us may be okay with it, but the average person walking further. So there's this horizon between where we are now, the code is way out here. There's just going to be kind of change friction of the culture kind of growing into the code, if you will. So I think that's important, that thing that I've always kind of thought a little bit about, and it's just going to be important for specificity to avoid some of that. Mr. Kadot, can I ask you to come up? This is a surprise. I'm not going to sing to you or wish you happy birthday, but I have a question that I think you can answer pretty well. Most of the development, as we're all aware, along the South Waterfront has been largely on the east side, and so along Sevier Avenue. So that's where the bulk of the development has happened. And so not so much on the west side. And so that's where Mr. Gadot lives, and he's one of 3 people on the advisory group who either live or own a business in the area on both sides of Chapman Highway. So the question is, I was going to ask you, sometimes you've done a good job, hopefully you could do it again, articulating what it is about the Sevier Avenue development that has come, that particularly related to transparency on the ground floor, what you want to see as development comes across Chapman Highway more frequently, specifically related to transparency. Why is that important?
Well, I know in our community, so we, the South Side Waterfront, which is our neighborhood, can you guys hear me all right? And then the Vestal neighborhood, so we talk a lot, we interact a lot, and it's kind of a community consensus that having the ground floor transparency, one of the reasons for it is walkability, so you're not just looking at a brick wall, but also one of the things that we're really concerned about is having the ground floor commercial retail, so that people who live over here have some place to go to kind of encourage that walkable community. So you have reason to walk somewhere, not just to walk your dog. You can, and it could also bring people from different parts of the community there. We'd really love to see more commercial hubs, or not commercial hubs, but community hubs. And uniting those community hubs. Is that answering your question?
You did a good job, just as I
Okay.
thought you would. Yeah, thank you. I think John's just been really good to communicate what he desires on the west side of Chapman Highway that is kind of evolved on Sevier Avenue. And the transparency item in here is adding some more rigidity to the form-based code, specifically requiring no variance over 10%. I think, did I get the language right? And again, that's based on variances that have come up, but at the heart of it, back to the vision plan, and partly what you just said is the desire to sleep, play, transact, buy, and kind of make it a little village. So if there's no businesses along that corridor to walk to, we may fail. So thank you for that. I have some other questions, but I'll let some council members ask some questions.
Thank you. And I just wanted to jump in, and I think Mr. Kadot mentioned this, but I think all of us that have mics know what transparency means, but I'm not sure that everyone in the audience, or maybe those watching at home or who might watch this in the future, know what that means. So, Ms. Albertson, could you maybe talk to us about transparency? I know we see the pictures. and
Yes.
I know what it means, but I don't know. Could you explain it so everyone understands what we're talking about?
I'll try my best. So generally, ground floor transparency is considered the first 10 feet up from where the building meets the street or the sidewalk. So the first 10 feet up would be the ground floor where you would measure transparency. So these would be, transparency would be windows, it could be doors, some other sort of feature that you can see through, that is clear, that is transparent. So here in One River Walk, you can see they have a mixture of doors and windows in that area, and then very minimal separation with just facade materials like bricks or other things. So the majority of the ground floor is transparent. You can see through it.
So
So I think the goal of transparency is all about the individual walking or biking. So in the planner idea is no blank walls, and I think a lot of urban spaces had blank walls for decades, or maybe a garage was built or a building with a big concrete wall, and that's not inviting. It's not always safe, and so having windows, having light, and transparency are really priorities within the South Waterfront, and that was one of the reasons we dug in on that item pretty quickly. I do want to say that the LIVE project at 451 that I think helped spur getting this resolution and our work, Rebecca Jane Justice and others, we heard the consternation. Councilman Smith specifically asked us to get directly with them, even though they received those variances. And so RJ has done that. And on building 100, I believe the transparency is about 60% now, and they could have gone down to almost 30 some odd percent. So we're really close on the transparency. They're going to put a coffee shop in on one corner, and then the other building, I believe it's 200, is at 58%. So I do want to say that we heard that loud and clear. There were community concerns. Councilman Smith asked us to get with them, and we've been pushing them. And so I feel like it's not perfect, but I think we've tried to meet in the middle quite a bit on that experience, and we can send council some renderings and the community the latest renderings on that if that helps.
And if I just may
Please go ahead.
humor me for 30 more seconds, I think the importance of the transparency on the ground floor is that maybe not even now that a business goes in there, but if there's enough density that gets built up along the South Waterfront, an owner of a building may down the road see that that's more profitable and then kind of flip the bottom into a business, which is, again, reinforces that connectivity and pedestrian shopping, et cetera.
Great. Thank you. Councilmember Ryder.
I was pushing my button. So, Ms. Albertson, so the next steps timeline and the suggestions that you presented, the revision recommendations, is that like incremental at this point? Like you guys have another meeting in July and you're going to talk about some other parts of the code. So right now what you've presented to us in terms of proposed revisions timeline, the August, the September, that's for what we saw tonight. You may have other stuff that comes at a different time.
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah.
That's all. I was just trying to figure out, we're just looking at a piece of the pie right now.
Yeah, I think we've worked hard. We've got two
Okay.
good recommendations. Our law department's reviewed them. The advisory
Okay.
committee has reviewed them. We're ready to push those forward and then start tackling the next two issues, which is level 2, level 3, and how do we encourage commercial on the first floor. Those are the two the topics we're going to start to get our arms around here in July and August.
Okay. And then I guess my other question is for Ms. McGrons is the advisory group recommendation from the slide about 70% required transparency on ground floor with no variance can be granted to reduce transparency more than 10%. I think my question is not so much about what the working group is coming up with in South Knoxville as we don't have any other place in our zoning code that we do that where we limit the amount that a variance can be, because a variance is based on the hardship of I can use my more or less. I can use my land not at all if you don't allow me this variance. I just think that's an interesting way. I feel like there are times where we've had conversations. I guess this is a hypothetical, philosophical question. There have been times in the past where, some of us have years more experience than others, where we've talked about how sometimes a variance is too much. You know what I mean? Like it's, let's say lot coverage, like maybe asking for 30% versus 70% is different. And I guess it's just interesting we don't limit that in other zoning codes, because we have design guidelines now baked into some of our code.
Yeah,
I don't know.
That may be something that, concerns may arise in the future where we come back and we need to have further edits to our zoning code because of that specific reason. But I do want to point out in our variance section, there is language in there that all variances must be the minimum adjustment necessary.
Okay.
I hear loud and clear what you're saying
Okay.
as far as people asking sometimes for too much. Maybe they get it, maybe they don't.
Right.
But, that is one thing that we as staff members, Brian Berry and myself, Mr. Aaron's, we all try very hard to remind the board that whatever you find in terms of the hardship, the minimum adjustment necessary has to be made to accommodate that hardship. We also have in our variance section a statement that anything that is listed as a prohibition, that is not something that can be varied, which is why you find this particular, the language kind of phrased in this particular manner. But I agree with you, there are some standards design-wise throughout the code where that may be something we need to look at in the future too as more concerns arise.
Okay, because the first thought I had in my head when I looked at this was, have we asked legal, what is that legal? Like, is that something good for us to bake into the thing? And obviously you're at the wheel or at the table with this, so yes.
Yep.
Okay, all right. Well, anyway, it's interesting.
Thank you. Councilmember Fugit.
Thank you. I don't know if this is a question or just a thought or what, so do with it as you will, but someone acknowledge that you hear me. So one of the things I'm hearing about the transparency, I mean, it is vitally important to walkability. We started doing that in downtown in order to get the kind of development we wanted. We did TIFs and pilots to incentivize, because creating ground floor spaces when there's not the density of population yet is a financial hardship to get financing and that kind of thing. So I know Councilman Smith has talked about this, and we've talked about this as a council, that a pilot does not have to be huge. Pilots and TIFs don't necessarily have to be huge. And so I assume that as y'all go into your next discussion about how to incentivize the transparency in the commercial, that will be also talked about, how those tools can be used as leverage to get what we want, because you have to have it before you can put the business in there, but oftentimes it's built when there's not the demand for the business yet.
Yes, that is a topic, and I think our current tool is the TIF, tax incremental financing. But yes, the group has discussed this. I mean, just to give you one example, the form-based code on Cumberland requires a specific use on the first floor. It's commercial. There's a lot of reasons for that. I think the density in that area, the number of units, and that was brought up by the advisory group. And I think that is something that we will continue to look at as we see more residents moving to this area. When does that become appropriate? I do think, and I've relayed this to Councilman Smith, something like that, I think we would have to broaden the discussion to the development community and the market that's trying to get projects financed. But yes, how do we get what we want? I think Councilman Smith talked about this. Transparency is one way to get it. Ultimately, we want coffee shops and bakeries, and we want restaurants and other neighborhood serving retail on the first floor. And the transparency allows that to happen in the future versus having a structure that doesn't allow for it. But yes, the group has talked about that, and yes, we will continue to work with the group and Councilman Smith on that.
Because I do think that's sometimes why people are asking for the variance, is because they're worried that too much transparency won't let them put in what they need to put in to make the numbers work. So it's the chicken and the egg.
It is. I do think right now, while housing is such an issue, and maybe we don't have the density there yet, that is a consideration for the advisory group to think about. And Councilman Smith, while we have a desperate need for housing, right now the market is driving housing to those first floors. So we need to just, again, there's a balance there, but at some point, like Cumberland, I hope that we can start to drive a use, and the group wants to talk about that.
Oh, it'll get there. It's just, what do you do in the meantime? Sort of like Tommy said, it's written for what we know we want. How do we get there? So it wasn't really a question, just a suggestion. Glad to know you're going to talk about it.
Thank you. Councilmember Smith.
Just have two more quick comments. One is, I've already forgotten one. The second one is related to parking. So I just wanted to ask Ms. Albertson if you had anything to add to this kind of thought, which is, we don't want to encourage standalone parking lots all over the south waterfront. But the purpose of this recommendation is to make sure that if it does happen, it's the most neighbor and environmental friendly parking lot in the city. Is that fair?
Yes, I would agree. And that it needs to be a landscaped parking lot and really fit in with the district and not, just be a sea of asphalt for the long term. So that there is some thought to putting in surface parking, that it's not just haphazard, that there really has to be a well-designed parking space.
And the other thought around that was, that if a standalone parking lot does happen, much like the transparency for retail on the ground floor, it may be a decade-long parking lot, right? Where then your density comes enough and then you can actually redevelop that lot and to have commercial on the ground floor. You were right. I waited long enough. The other one would come back. Much like I think it's 13 priorities for redevelopment, it's in a perfect world, we would have an asterisk, I think maybe for the South Waterfront, that says retail on the bottom equals some type of TIF support. So the incentives are an important part of our July working session. That's it.
Councilmember Thomas.
Yes, kind of a general question for whoever may want to answer it. These are the only two areas in the city, the South Waterfront and Cumberland, that have the form-based code. What was the driver? How was that initiated, and how did those two areas be chosen?
I might let someone speak that sort of endured the vision plan process.
Right.
She means someone older who's been here a long
Well,
time.
that's why I ask it generally to the panel, because I know this happened before a lot of us were,
Joe Holquist.
My neighbor. There's a lot of Island Homers actually here, myself. So let me start with South Waterfront. So when Mayor Haslam came into office, that was an area where there wasn't investment, and it was a classic River City industrial uses, brownfield, grayfield, on the water, which is every city in America. And so there was a desire to start to plan that effort out, right? We started to have the downturn. It was a great time to go ahead and do planning and visioning for an area, knowing that, this was a significant downturn. And so you start to do the planning, do the work. Well, the market is not there, and plan for the initial infrastructure like a Suttree Landing Park, so that when the market turns, that you're ready for that. And so the interest really started at an executive level with Mayor Haslam and with the community. And for a long time, South Knoxville has felt like there haven't been resources, and that's not been a priority for the community. And so I think Mayor Haslam heard that. He also then responded with the planning effort and that vision plan. Again, Councilman Smith mentioned this to me. We've got to honor this incredibly in-depth process that has allowed us to start to see the fruits of that process now. So that was the South Waterfront. When you look at Cumberland, there was the vision around transforming that commercial space. So Cumberland was seeing disinvestment. It was, back in the 50s, 60s, and 70s, it was essentially a suburban portion of our community. It was a suburban corridor that had very automobile-centric services, fast food, local restaurants. That had started to change, and we were starting to see significant disinvestment. And so with the interest in addressing land use and zoning, the Form District was selected as the tool to help do that. And I think, again, what we have seen is consolidation of parcels, many of them owned by the same kind of family for many, many, many years. And so those consolidations in more vertical, more dense urban form. And so that was, I believe, why that district came on board, was, again, the disinvestment. And again, I think nostalgia is powerful, that Cumberland was a really hot, really strong, energetic area, but it hasn't. I was at UT in the 90s, and they were starting to see a lot of decline in the 90s. And so that's really what started to drive the Cumberland Avenue project. And very similar to South Waterfront, the tool the city has used has been infrastructure. So Suttree Landing Park, streetscapes, that's what we did on Cumberland. So, the city doesn't build housing, but we can provide the infrastructure and perhaps a tool to bring that housing in or that commercial in. So Like those are really good examples of why those districts were selected and why those tools work. Now, I know somebody may ask, well, why don't we do form-based code throughout the entire city? And I think there's a lot of, we did the recode process. This community talked about what our zoning code looked like for a number of years. The incentives, the TIFs that go along with those types of infrastructure projects, again, that would be a really, really big project. So we've learned a lot from the two we have. We've got a hybrid model right now, and recode, I think, was really the big project that we tackled the whole city from a land use perspective.
Thank you. That was very good to get that context.
Thank you. Councilmember Ryder.
Whoever. I don't have a question. I just wanted to make a comment because we were talking about density and like talking about the retail and the commercial and the density and the balance of that. For anybody who went to Big Ears and hung out for a while anywhere downtown, it was interesting to observe, like at Marble City Market particularly, we kind of go there with some frequency, and the density that brought, like the number of people, it wasn't overwhelmed, the commercial that we had, but it was like the density of all the people that showed up for Big Ears and all of the locals that showed up for it was the right amount of people to be served by all the venues, the restaurants and et cetera downtown. And as I sat there and watched sometime while we were eating one day, was just to look at the amount of density that came with that event. And I was like, this is the amount of density that we need to support these businesses. And so, because often sometimes we go to some of these businesses and we're like, it doesn't appear to be the density to support them on a day-to-day basis, but that's what we needed. So it's like however many beds were in those hotels and however many people came to that event, that's the number of dwelling units and people we need to support all that commercial that we've got down there. So it was an interesting observation as I sat there that weekend. So.
Well, and I guess the thing I wanted to add was, obviously our discussion today was specifically around walkability, transparency, but then also dealing with how are you going to address parking. And I really liked that in the parking, you already have this recommendation of having landscaping and making sure I think there was a shade tree that was in there as well at certain growth stages. So I thought all of that was really good. What we're really talking about is focusing in on making sure that we're having a very walkable space. And certainly, I think when I've heard from folks in South Knoxville, one of the things I have heard is parking. And I think that gets to what Councilmember Smith was saying, where maybe the code is it's future leaning, and we're not quite there yet. I think is kind of what you were saying. We're growing into it was I think what you said, which I think is also good. Looking to the future, I think is good. And maybe I guess my question this is for Ms. Toker is, are you still hearing about parking as being an issue, and do you feel like this is going to help with that? I mean, I guess my thought is that if you don't plan for parking to happen at some point, then it may happen in a way that you don't want it to. And once it's there, it may be there for a long time. So I guess, are you still hearing concerns about parking in the neighborhoods? And do you feel like this is going to help address that, at least looking into the future?
I'm not sure that I'm the best person to answer that because I don't live down there.
Okay.
There are some people that do live down there. Patty.
Yeah.
Patty Barrier lives on Phillips.
Patty, do you want to speak about parking for a second?
Yeah.
So I'm just not the best person to answer
Gotcha.
that.
And I appreciate that. Can you give us your name, please?
Yes, Patty Barrier. I live
Welcome.
at 807 Phillips Avenue in SW1. Anyways, pertaining to parking, the parking issue, at least for the 4 blocks of Phillips where we have the parking permits is in general working very well. However, when there are events, because they're only intermittent period of time, people do illegally park there. So if you have like a couple of apartments in a house, their people may not have anywhere to park. Some people have to put cones out, so they themselves, if they go a lot of people, I know we usually end up not going anywhere those days because we're pretty sure we probably won't have a parking space when we get back. So pertaining to, and a lot of people are parking between Phillips and Langford, which parking is not allowed because of the steep slope. There are instances around the school, places like that, where people are parking on both sides to go to events. And it would be almost impossible for a fire truck to get through, or an emergency vehicle. There is no patrolling of the area by KPD to make sure that things are being followed during an event. Most people don't want to park and walk to the event. They want to be, I don't know. I have 2 artificial knees and I still go out and walk, so I don't know. Is there anything else with regards to that?
That really helped me a lot just to understand. I think what you're looking at is if you have that type of situation where people are having to put out cones and you're having a difficulty with parking, eventually something's going to happen where there's going to be some parking put in. And I think what we're looking at here is proactively dealing with that and making sure that it's in this recommendation that it's going to have landscaping and not be a sea of asphalt look. And so I just wanted to check with you and see, or somebody from the neighborhood, and see how parking is going and whether or not you felt like, if you did have to have some parking put in, this would be a good way of doing it.
Yes, and we don't want to lose our permitted parking for the residents that live on Phillips because it has been instrumental.
Okay. Very good.
Some enforcement.
Good.
Okay, thanks.
Thank you so much. Councilmember Smith.
I think I'll just close this off with that comment about parking that, Ms. Barrier mentioned that there is a residential parking permit. We started it as a pilot about 1.5 years ago, and it seems to be working well. At the same time, there are new apartments being built, and a lot of times we haven't figured out the best way as a city to make sure that apartment guests overnight don't fill up all the public parking. So to borrow a phrase, I think from a parking standpoint in South Knoxville, we're still kind of scruffy, where it's a little wild, wild south sometimes on busy weekends, but this is progress.
Very good. All right, that seems like a good way to close. Seeing no more questions from council, this meeting is adjourned. Thank you all very much for attending.